What was the purpose of the purity laws in the Old Testament? And how do they differ from the purity traditions of the Pharisees at the time of Jesus? Welcome back to Digging Deeper, where we visit with prominent New Testament scholars on important issues in the Gospel of Mark. I'm Carl Cosart, the writer and host of Reliving Mark, Discovering Jesus in Israel. This is the second part of my four-part interview with Dr. Mueller, who's a professor of New Testament and an expert in the Gospel of Mark. So Dr. Mueller, thank you for joining us again for this conversation. You know, we talked a lot about ritual purity in the various episodes of Reliving Mark, but I wonder maybe you could tell us a little bit more about ritual purity in the Old Testament. How did those laws come about, and what was their purpose?
The purity regulations are a set of laws in Leviticus, largely Leviticus 12 to 15, that deal with what we can sometimes call the messiness of life. The first part of Leviticus deals with sin on the one hand and how to mitigate sin. You offer a sacrifice at the temple, and this is how you should offer a sacrifice, and this is what the priest should be doing to atone for the sin. Or maybe you have a sacrifice that you want to say, I want to thank God for something in my life. Then there's an offering for that as well. But then, kind of in the center section of Leviticus, we now have a section that deals with purity and impurity. And this is a specific set of rules that try to reason out and think through how does the relationship between humans and God exist when messiness happens in our life. And it relates to the reality that God is holy and pure, and human beings at times come in contact with things that are not quite aligned with the character of God. And these might be natural things, but they're nonetheless don't fit into the character of who God is. One example of that would be sickness. Sickness is all around us, and we realize looking around us that people die of sickness, people suffer because of sickness, and that is unfortunately a part of our human nature, and yet it is in conflict to who God is. So the question is, how should we relate to this sickness? Or death as another example. God, the ultimate life giver. How can we stand in His presence if we have been surrounded by death? And the idea here is this relationship. How do we restore the relationship if we live in the reality of an impure world as opposed to God who is pure? And there's a way to mitigate that. And the purity laws restore that relationship between God and the subjects. At the same time, it's also a way to explore how do we deal with one another as human beings, especially in cases of contagious sickness, in terms of death, in terms of other bodily functions. For example, if we lose blood, how do you deal with blood? How do you deal with skin diseases where you have oozing or pus? So this is this messiness of life. These might be natural processes. Some of them are good. They mean that some healing is happening. Some of them are bad. But all of them have some element that is in contrast to the pure and perfect being who God is, and it means protection of the people and the community. That's what ritual laws are about. And so we might just say there are three major categories, and these blend and overlap, of course, but for simplicity purposes. There is the category of death, and this is the most severe of contractions of impurity that you can have if you come in contact with death. And that is a dead animal, a carcass, or if you're in contact with a dead human being, a corpse. How do you deal with this? The second category relates to sicknesses, various sicknesses of the human body, and that includes, for example, skin diseases, and that could be even contagious diseases that might spread to another person. So how do you deal with that element? And that usually means that you go to a priest and you have it evaluated and you're quarantined. Some of the things that we even today would say are a natural and good process in terms of separation from the community. Again, it's about protecting people, both the individual and the community. And finally, there's a category of what we might call the life and death cycle, things that have to do with reproductive health and with childbirth and all these things associated with that. And here again, protection and purity are the ideas. Some of these are important and actually requirements for human beings. So we should take care of our parents, and that means we have the obligation to take care of family members who have died, maybe parents that have died. That is a command from God, in fact. And that is not sinful, and yet we come in contact with a dead person. Even though we've done something honorable, we are now realizing that this is does not fit God's ultimate character. And so there's a procedure of how to become pure again. And this is a very simple procedure for most of the time, for most of these offenses. And offenses might not even be the right word, but infractions. And that means you would wait. There's usually a time element. You wait a certain amount of time. Most of these is wait till the evening, and then you do a washing. And this would be a ritual washing that includes water to some degree. Most of the time, in Jewish communities, they would build a mikvaot, a basin in which you could dip yourself and walk into and walk out, a water basin. And then you would be restored, and you could engage again with the wider community. Sometimes, especially if you're talking about mold or skin diseases where there is a concept of contagious disease or contagious elements, then somebody might need to evaluate that. For example, a priest, you would go and visit a priest and they would explore that. These are the purity laws, and they're intended to remind us of the perfect and pure character of God and our reality that is sometimes not quite pure, impure reality of life. At the same time, it is also meant to be a protection. It is a protection for the individual. They get removed from the society to be protected. For example, a mother and her children after childbirth, they are protected. They're not supposed to be touched. They're not supposed to be infractum. And that allows bonding and protection in a vulnerable stage of life. Sometimes for 40 days, sometimes for 80 days, mother and child are protected and set aside. It could also be protection for the whole community. The whole community is protected from a contagious disease by an individual being put in quarantine, so to speak. So these were rules and regulations that deal with the messiness of life, those things that we sometimes call are yucky. They're not sinful and they're not bad, but they are these fringes where we realize that they are infringing upon the purity of what God intended for us. And they're a reminder that we live in an impure world.
So are the purity issues regarding unwashed hands in Mark 7 the same as the purity laws in the Old Testament, or are they different?
That is a very important question. And the simple answer is no, but. So let me explain that. The purity issues in Mark 7 are not exactly the same as the purity issues in the Old Testament. They have adopted and developed further. There's one essential element that is the same, and that is touch impurity. And that has the idea, as we talked about the contagious diseases and that kind. If somebody is impure, they can pass on that impurity to an object or another person if they have not segregated themselves, or if they have not washed themselves or waited the allotted period of time. So touch impurity means that this impurity that somebody has accrued for whatever reason gets passed on from one person to the next. And this is now the process of transmission. And in the Second Temple period, a period after the Babylonian exile, people became very concerned and worried. What if I become contaminated? And this is now the big concern, not so much the purity regulations themselves, but the transmission of impurity. And it produced a lot of skepticism and worries within the community. Did the other person do the right washing? Are they threatening me by contaminating me? And so people became very concerned. And the religious leaders as well, they transferred this idea of purity from a connection to the temple to everyday life. And that's what we see here in this passage, that the accusation against the disciples is, wait, they are eating a meal without properly washing their hands. In fact, in the Old Testament, that was never an issue. You didn't have to be pure all the time. You had to be pure in terms of protecting other people, but also in terms of the temple, in relation to the temple. But the extrapolation in the Second Temple period is like, we need to be pure all the time. And so every meal now, they needed to be pure. And this is what Mark introduces to us at the beginning of the passage. Every time they come from the marketplace, anytime they suspect that somebody might have passed something on to them, contaminated them, not because of a health issue, but because of a ritual issue. And this is now the big concern among the religious leaders. And now they want everybody to adhere to these expanded rules that go far beyond the rules of the Old Testament. So they've extrapolated it and enlarged it in terms of the time and the space, but they've also done one other thing. And that is they've expanded it in terms of the event. So there are two general categories of impurity. The first is existential impurity. And that means something is always impure under certain conditions. For example, the animals, unclean animals, are always unclean. A pig is always unclean. And that means you cannot eat it. But you could touch it. There's nothing said about touching it. A pig does not transfer its contamination if you just touch it. But if you eat it, well, then you have been contaminated. So there is an existential, meaning it always is. There's nothing that the pig can do to change its status. But there are other issues that come and go. For example, a skin disease, or that you're losing blood because you have a wound or something. Then you are impure, but that will go away in a short period of time. So what the religious leaders now did, they tried to understand the Old Testament and apply it to as many possibilities and situations in life. So they expanded these rules largely, and they conflated some of these issues. So when they say, I can't go into the marketplace without being contaminated, they're implying that other people, human beings, can transmit their impurity to them on an existential basis, regardless of a specific situation that they might have met. And this is where this expansion just becomes almost crazy and not just impractical, but goes way beyond the Old Testament regulations. That's the situation that Jesus is living with, that these Old Testament rules have been put to a nonsensical level, where it seems that it's almost, and some scholars have said, it's more about control that the religious leaders are trying to have over the population than it is actually the concern about being in a pure relationship with God and protecting your community. The original purpose of these laws has been completely lost. And this is part of the reason why Jesus challenges them on this issue of purity. To summarize it, no, the issue of purity has been largely expanded and is not the same. The Old Testament and the New Testament rules build on the same concept, but the New Testament situation that Jesus is addressing is a very different one, in which these laws have been expanded and are now applying to all kinds of situations that God had never intended.
So in light of the Pharisees' views about ritual purity, what did they think about Jesus? How did they view him?
They seem to not have any issue with Jesus himself at the outset of their question. They just say your disciples are not doing a certain procedure, a certain ritual. So the real problem they have with Jesus is that he is not enforcing the traditions of the elders upon his disciples. He's just letting it go. Jesus is now taking this to a larger level. He's not just saying, well, let's not worry so much about it, or I'll take it a little easy on this issue. He actually challenges the religious leaders very strongly on this point. because he wants to get rid of this expansion that has developed under the Second Temple period. This time period after the exile where people expanded these rules. So Jesus is trying to dial it back and saying, you don't need to be in a state of purity at all times. Not every meal needs to be consumed in a state of purity. If you go to the temple, then you need to be pure. And additionally, don't expand the rules from a touch impurity to an existential impurity. That is not something that Jesus condones. And Jesus is very forceful that he will not bow to their demands. So how did they view him? Well, I'm sure they were very frustrated. In the story, we don't hear them talk about this, or, as we heard in the Sabbath account, plot for another murder. They retreat. They have no answers to his objections. They are probably shamed into disappearing from the scene.
So how does Jesus respond to these allegations from the Pharisees against his disciples? What was Jesus' view of purity?
In specifics, Jesus deals with the accusation in a twofold way. Jesus pulls the rug from right underneath their feet in terms of the authority and challenging why they have even come to this point. Jesus reverting back to the law of God and the words of God. That should be our guiding principle, not the traditions of men. And this, I think, is a really important point that we sometimes miss. It is so easy for us to create certain rules of behavior and to follow certain rules that have been established maybe by the society or community or our religious context. We all do it in some way. And it's easy to look down upon people and frown on them if they're not following these rules. And these include matters of clothing, for example. Is it appropriate or not to wear a tie? Or is it appropriate or not to wear a skirt as a woman or as a man? Is it mandatory or not? And the surprising thing is, if we come together from different parts of the world, we suddenly realize how much tradition we have. I realize this personally a lot on this small campus that we have where 80 different communities and cultures are represented from 80 different countries in the world. And we have people from the islanders where it is traditional for men to wear skirts. And then there are other communities where men are not allowed to wear skirts and women are not allowed to wear pants, only skirts. And all of these rules, if we were to put them together, would be self-contradictory. So we have added cultural rules and then religious rules. I remember growing up and hearing in our community quite a bit of this is what you're allowed to do on Sabbath, this is not what you're allowed to do. And these are all traditions that don't have a biblical basis at times. And we forget it. They might be wholesome and they might have been intended with good purposes when they started off. They might actually be something that you want to adhere to. And that's totally fine. But it is a very different thing if they become mandatory for other people and if we lose sight of God's word in the process. There's a second way that Jesus responds to that in the second part of this conflict story. And that is he reshapes the focus. And he says, yes, there are purity regulations, but worry less about your purity regulations and worry more about your ethical behavior. How do you behave on a day-to-day basis? Worry about he cites some of the 10 Commandments about proper living. Don't steal, don't say nasty things, don't have an evil eye, don't look after other women if you're a man. Jesus cites all kinds of daily life issues and says, be concerned about these. It's not wrong to follow the purity regulations of the Old Testament. Jesus will enforce or recommend that again, but in the proper sense of how God wanted it to be done. Understand and what God really wants from you, and that is a change in heart, not just a strict adherence to a certain set of regulations, and especially not extrapolated laws where you're just expanding upon what God had originally said. So Jesus really challenges the religious leaders in these two ways, by changing the authority and removing the tradition of men, and then saying, focus not just on the act itself, but also on the principle behind it, and live that out in your daily life. That is an ethical person. In essence, we could summarize it as Jesus does in another place: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the two things. And Jesus uses 13 at the end of this chapter, in verse 21 and 22 and 23. He uses 13 descriptions of how we should live ethical life. And these are a sample of many other passages that we find in the Levitical Code and the Ten Commandments.
Dr. Mueller, thank you. This has really been a fascinating study. And now that we understand more about the purity traditions and views of the Pharisees at the time of Jesus, in our next episode we can tackle the statement about Jesus purifying all foods and what that means. So I hope you can join us for that conversation. Until then, take care and thanks for watching.